tariffs are an act of economic self-harm. The tax foundation has modelled Trump's tariff increases, and they equate to the biggest tax increase on American consumers since 1982. These kind of conversations are kind of inevitable in a low-growth or zero-growth society, because everything becomes zero-sum. Everything becomes dog-eat-dog. This seems to be the kind of nail in the coffin, if it was needed, for the World Trade Organization and the multilateral approach to trade liberalization.
In the Piketty chart, and he was trying to make the point that this is somehow inherent in capitalism, but how can that be the case if it's really just one asset?
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today, as usual, I'm joined by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, we're officially at trade war this week, but before we dive into that, I'd like to remind you to follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. That's the way that you can get all of our content straight to your inbox, get event invitations, hear podcasts as soon as they come out, and get exclusive paid content too. Now, on with the show. So this week, Trump has finally given us some clarity on what his tariff plan is. And I've got it in front of me here. It's a long list of slightly random numbers ranging from 46% to the minimum of 10%, which we find ourselves on here in Blighty. Kristian, what do you make of it? What's going on?
Well, it's completely mad. I've never seen anything like it. I was at the pub when this was announced, and I wasn't following it, but it was somebody from one of the neighboring think tanks who was. He was looking at his phone every now and then. At some point, he just froze completely, staring at the phone in disbelief. And I said to him, well, what are you doing? And it turned out he was trying to make sense of this list and of the formula behind it. So there was a formula where the idea was originally that you would set the tariff rate for each country in such a way that it eliminates the trade deficit or brings the trade balance to zero. And you do that by modeling to what extent imports from a particular country respond to tariffs, which depends on two things. Firstly, to what extent do tariffs get passed on to consumers? And then secondly, once that happened, to what extent do consumers respond to these price changes? So it's about responsiveness to tariff changes. And they were trying to model that country by country and then set the parameters in such a way that you eliminate the trade deficit with every country. But I guess, I don't know, maybe he gave this to a group of interns at the White House who couldn't be bothered to do it. And then they just chose two of the parameters in such a way that they cancel each other out. So you're just left with the trade deficit or trade balance divided by imports and then divided by 2 for whatever reason. And that's how you get these numbers. So they gave up essentially on this attempt to make it dependent on the responsiveness or to tariff changes, anything of that nature. They just looked at really the total trade deficit divided by the number of imports, and that's it. That's how they that's how they came up with this list.
But they're trying to sell it as reciprocal tariffs. That the sort of numbers that they've got listed here is, but they're desperately trying. So they're just wrong about that. Basically, there's no reciprocity involved at all.
No, that's because if you look at the formula, so tariff rates are not even in there. Non-tariff barriers are not in there either. None of that stuff is in there. They're not even trying to put it into the formula. The assumption behind it, I think we've said this before on this podcast, that Trump seems to believe that any kind of trade deficit must be the result of something dodgy. That if the United States has a trade deficit with any country, it must mean they're doing something bad. They're doing something illegitimate. There must be some hidden barriers that they impose on the US. And, well, in a way, this chart, this formula that they're using is putting that idea into practice. That's the only way in which you can kind of make sense of it. But even then, so, I mean, this is the difference. During Trump's first term, it was still possible to steelman the argument where you could say, well, this looks a bit random, but maybe this is the thinking behind it. Maybe you can somehow discern a theory behind it. In this case, you can't really do it. But this is really so. I guess none of our listeners will be surprised to hear that we think tariffs are a bad idea, and that if we have to draw up a list of that of tariffs in this way, it would be 0, 0, 0, 0. It would be, well, you would basically do a millet, start with this list and do an afuera, afuera, afuera. But that's not really the point. You could still try to think of what would be a second best solution. If you can't eliminate tariffs, what would be the least bad way? If you must have some tariffs, what would be maybe a version that we could live with? And this would be a million miles away even from that. So I guess the least bad way, if you must have some tariffs, would be to have just a flat rate that doesn't discriminate. So Chile had that for a while, a 10% flat rate on all imports. If you do it in that way, that means, well, you reduce trade, but at least there is no lobbying involved, and there is no distortion beyond just the reduction in trade. Yeah. But here you have, if every country has its own tariff rate, that is massively distortionary. So you will get a completely different international division of labor on the basis of this. You will redirect trade flows and production patterns, supply chains, all in a completely random way, and all on the basis of a whim.
I mean, this seems to be the kind of nail in the coffin, if it was needed, for the World Trade Organization and the multilateral approach to trade liberalization. Because the whole point there is that, yes, you can have bilateral deals and regional deals and stuff, but you basically have a most favored nation rate, so that outside of those deals, the best tariff rate you offer to any other country, you have to offer to everybody. And that was those were sort of the rules of the road. And Trump has just sort of gleefully ripped it up. And I did find, and I only watched a little bit of the announcement because I had to turn it off. It was unbearable. But it was just a ludicrous spectacle, him standing here with his chart of tariffs and handing out hats and stuff, and to sort of gleefully wreak economic damage that way. I mean, I found it absurd, frankly. And I guess this isn't really news to anybody. There are some things that Trump is good on, there are some things he's bad on, and there are some things, and we're looking at one here where he's just truly terrible, and the economics of it are basically a disaster. But I think if you do look at this as being basically the end, maybe the very delayed end of the multilateral trading system, it kind of seems dead and buried at this point. And what you're going to get is basically a complicated mess of bilateral deals and regional blocks and a much more sort of multipolar trading world. And, you know, I think from a free market libertarian perspective, that WTO multilateral trade liberalization approach, you know, it was a second best, Kristian, as you say. We would much rather just have, you know, unilateral free trade, no tariffs, no non-tariff barriers, just accept the logic of trade that it's mutually beneficial. And you benefit by letting it happen as much as you possibly can. And I know some libertarians were always a bit suspicious of, well, this isn't free trade, it's managed trade through these trade deals and through the multilateral organizations. And I kind of get that. But equally, so much better than the direction we seem to be heading now. And I think the crucial thing here, just from our little Westminster perspective, is how does the UK respond? And it seems to me initially that the government is responding in the right way. They're basically saying, no, we don't want to retaliate. We'd rather come to some better arrangement. It is slightly hilarious that in order to keep their options open on retaliation, they've had to launch a consultation over the next month on the impact of tariffs, because of course you can't do anything in Whitehall without first having a pointless online consultation.
I think that's on that point though. You're not wrong that you can't do anything in Whitehall without a pointless consultation, but I actually think, to be more sympathetic, that consultations are also can be a useful tool to long grass something that you don't want to.
I suppose that's a good point.
So they will be thinking. There's a good chance that they're thinking that we don't want to do retaliatory tariffs. But it's a question that we maybe need to think about for political or geopolitical reasons or whatever. 12-week consultation. That'll pop a pause on it for a little bit at least.
Well, so let's be clear about this. I know we say it all the time, but it's worth stressing. tariffs are an act of economic self-harm. And so you look at this from the American perspective, the Tax Foundation has modeled Trump's his tariff increases, and they equate to the biggest tax increase on American consumers since 1982. So it's a 1% of GDP tax increase this year. Long-run impact on GDP is to knock about a percentage point off. 700,000 fewer jobs in the long run as well. And okay, that's just one model, and that's all things being equal. Who knows what else will happen in the intervening period? But this is Trump taxing his consumers and indeed American businesses who use imported inputs. It's going to harm America first and foremost. The knock-on effect on the rest of the world is not so much that we're being shut out of American markets, although obviously for some businesses that will be a significant problem. This is much more of that old thing of America sneezes and the world catches a cold. The economic impact, the slowdown that's going to occur is primarily because America is harming its own economy. Now, if we were to retaliate in kind, we would just be harming ourselves even more. That's why I think the government is right to soft pedal this, even if they're not ruling out retaliation altogether. And I just think one other thing, that I've seen stories in the press about people are very concerned that a bunch of goods which were otherwise heading for America might be diverted to the UK, and we might just have a massive influx of cheap consumer goods.
Welcome.
Don't threaten me with a good time, okay? Where exactly is the problem there?
It's a very, very good question. So do you think then that just to clarify, that the impact on the UK of the tariffs will actually be the damage is almost more done by the slowdown in America's economy than it is by the actual tariffs on us?
Yeah, in the short run, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
But also that trading partners get hurt by this. So therefore, this whole logic, we got off likely only 10%. The European Union has 20%. Yes, of course. But whatever damages them, damages us as well.
Wait, so do we think? I mean, is that a Brexit benefit to be hailed? The fact that we've only got 10% at all, or is it a win for Keir Starmer's negotiation tactics, or is it actually something else?
I guess if you wanted to label it a Brexit benefit, you could. It's just that nobody campaigned for Brexit on that basis. That something like this was going to happen. So.
Well, I think the other thing is that we don't actually have, from the American perspective, there isn't a trade deficit in goods with Britain. So actually, we should have come out of their crappy formula looking even better, but we've had to be rounded up to the minimum 10% rate. So
I guess one thing that could be a Brexit benefit is if we were able to do some serious trade liberalisation ourselves, while the EU maybe is more eager with the retaliatory approach. I mean, whether we'll see that is a different question, but because of Brexit, we have that option at the very least.
Yeah, that's true. And that would be clearly the right thing to do, even if... We've said this before that we don't believe in the idea of retaliation because that's just the wrong model to think about it. Retaliation makes sense if you can wield a weapon against somebody else and whack them over the head for something that they've done to you. But this is more a case of you have to inflict significant harm on yourself first before the other guy feels it too, and that is almost a side effect of that. But even if in principle you believe that is a possibility, and that you can maybe get another country to adopt a more liberal approach to trade because you threaten them in some way. Just kind of think of this as a form of game theory. Clearly, a government that comes up with a chart like this, it doesn't work that way. You can't play game theory with them. So even if in principle you believe in the idea that through retaliation, through threats, that you can somehow strong arm another economy into adopting a more liberal approach to trade than they otherwise would, maybe there is a case if you're dealing with a halfway economically rational actor, but not with somebody who comes up with a chart like this.
We don't negotiate with terrorists, basically. Well, actually, I mean, we could sit and talk trade all day, and we've talked about many times in this podcast already, and we'll continue to do so. So let's pivot a little bit to another topic, more domestic related. Tom, this week you wrote in the Telegraph about savings and what the Chancellor is plotting to do with ISAs and cash savings, and why she shouldn't touch them. Do you want to walk us through what is the Chancellor talking about? What's on the horizon?
Yeah, well, it turned out to be quite a timely piece. I didn't have any inside information here, but a few days later, the Chancellor has seemingly confirmed that she is going to change cash ISAs at the upcoming budget. And I think there's no detail yet, but the assumption is, at the moment, I should say, for anyone who doesn't know, maybe some of our international listeners, ISAs are individual savings accounts, so they're a tax-free savings vehicle in the UK. And as a rule, you can save up to £20,000 a year in your ISA. And at the moment, there's no particular rules. It can go into cash, it can go into stocks and shares, but the government isn't trying to force you into any kind of particular asset allocation or anything. It seems like that now is going to change, and the Chancellor has been lobbied mostly by people who make their money from the fees on stocks and shares ISAs to clamp down on the cash aspect of the ISA so that you can only put, let's say, £4,000 a year into a tax-free cash savings vehicle where you're earning interest. And if you want to still save the same amount tax-free, if you can go up to the 20,000, then all of the rest would have to be in stocks and shares at that point. So from the Chancellor's perspective, this is about trying to steer more of British savings into equities. There have been rumours in the past, and I don't know whether this is still kind of on the agenda, that she might try and steer more savings into British equities particularly. These are different but increasingly worse versions of the same thing, which is the government getting involved and telling consumers, you should put your money here, you should invest this way. Now, it's worth saying, I think that Brits probably do underinvest in equities. They probably do, as a rule, hold too much cash than would be sort of financially beneficial or optimal for them. And I think that we have extremely strict rules on who can offer financial advice in this country and what counts as financial advice. And I think because of that, you have a kind of consumer saving and investment market, which really is quite kind of uneducated. People don't have good information. And so I think people feel maybe a lot scared of going into higher risk assets, even if they've got very long savings time horizons and it would make sense for them to do so. So there is a problem there, but I think we could fix that by relaxing some of the rules about financial advice and making it much easier for people to get, very basic financial investment literacy advice, kind of online for free, all of that kind of thing. Anyway, we don't have that. And so I think as a response, they're trying to say, well, we'll change the tax treatment. We'll try and steer more savings in this direction rather than that direction. Now, the thing is, it's perfectly rational for some people to accumulate lots of cash. So it could be that you're saving up, trying to put down a housing deposit in the next 5 years, let's say. You want that in cash, not in the stock market. It could be that you're retired and you're living out of your income. You don't want a lot of risk there. So again, you'd lean more towards cash. These are questions that I just think the government shouldn't be getting involved in. But there's also a larger point here, which is that I think in the Treasury, and maybe this is a more widespread state of mind as well, we think about things like pension tax relief and individual savings accounts as incentives that we give people to save, that we're trying to encourage particular behaviours from savers and so on through the tax rules. And effectively, that makes everything fair game. You think, oh, well, they're not saving enough in stocks. Well, we'll tweak the tax rules and get them to save more in stocks. From my perspective, this is a complete misunderstanding of what the tax relief on savings is all about. The point is that a comprehensive income tax system will almost inevitably discriminate against saving and investment. It creates a structural bias in the tax system against present consumption and in favour of future consumption. Actually, what you're doing...
Other way around.
What did I say? I'm always doing this. I don't know what I'm saying. Yeah.
A bias against future consumption.
A bias against future consumption and in favour of present consumption. So effectively, you will be taxed more heavily in future if you save than you will if you just consume your income now, overall. And that's a big problem because it kind of eats away at the seed corn of future prosperity. And when you introduce savings tax relief, the whole point is to restore a degree of neutrality, so that it doesn't matter from a tax perspective whether you consume now or whether you consume later. The tax treatment will be broadly the same. And then you get the more kind of natural or market-driven level of savings and investments, and that is good for a whole host of other reasons.
Yeah, what we also see in this, the reason why this issue pops up every now and then, is that we're in this resolution foundation mindset where everything is modeled in terms of distributional charts. And if you have a tax relief, deduction, whatever, for savings, then yes, on the whole, richer people will benefit more from that than poorer people. But that doesn't mean that you should somehow discriminate against savings. This is one of those areas where not every single aspect of the tax system has to be progressive, as long as the system as a whole is. That's what matters. There may well be some elements in it that are not, and this is one of them. But it's every time this comes up, you get somebody with a resolution foundation type argument saying, "Oh, look, but high earners, people who pay higher rates of income tax, benefit from this more than somebody who just pays the basic rate or so." And on his own, true.
Yeah, we will come back to the Resolution Foundation inequality question in a moment. But just before we do, Tom, could you walk us through or give us a bit of a sense of how our sort of tax and savings regime compares internationally? Well, how do other countries do it? And
well, I mean, the thing to understand actually is that most countries, most modern tax systems have this unfortunate aspect to them because we tend to focus on taxing earnings and income. Rather than focusing more on taxing consumption or expenditure, you get that bias against saving and investment. So there may be a country out there that is doing it perfectly. I'm not sure I'm aware of one. Britain, as things stand, is not the worst by any stretch of the imagination. Actually, there are attractive elements to our tax system. The availability of the individual savings account for savings up to 20 grand a year, pension tax relief, which although it's been, fiddled with far more than it should have been over the years, and it's become much less generous as a result, partly because of some of those distributional concerns that Kristian raises. It's still better than it is in many other countries, but it's a mess. It lacks a kind of coherent logic. And, from my perspective, the direction that we should be moving, and really the energy of free market tax reformers, I think, should be in this direction. It's to remodel our income tax system, and you can throw national insurance in there as well, so that the base is not so much income, but consumed income, so that it becomes an expenditure tax kind of akin to VAT. I mean, as a rule, I think free market economists much prefer a consumption base to an income base because you don't get the discrimination against savings and investment. Therefore, you get more capital accumulation and therefore you get more growth in the long run.
Fascinating. I'm sure we'll be revisiting it because it doesn't look like Rachel Reeves is going to necessarily take the right decision on it. So we'll have more to say on it, hopefully, in the future. Now, to come back to, Kristian, your point on the Resolution Foundation question, the question of inequality is rising up the agenda again, along the lines of our wealth tax discussion last week. But I think the sort of broad question is, are we becoming a more unequal society? One. Two, if so, does that matter and should we care?
Kristian? Not right now. I mean, there is so there was, of course, a big increase in income inequality in the 1980s, and then with the lag effect, because wealth inequality is usually lagging income inequality. Wealth inequality also increased somewhat. I think it was at its lowest around 1990 or so, and then went up a bit. But that's not recent. It's been flat ever since. And so Gini coefficient or top 10% relative to bottom 10%, those standard measures of inequality are not showing much of a change recently. And that's one of the problems, that when this gets discussed in the media, it's always with the implication that this is happening now, it's spiraling out of control. No, it's fair to say that Britain is now more unequal than it was in the 1970s or 1960s. Fair enough. It's also true that Britain is more unequal than some of the neighbors, and Sweden or Denmark. All true, but none of this is new. There is nothing that is happening now or that has been happening in the past 10 or 20 years. So to the extent that it causes any problems, they must already be there. Now, specifically on wealth inequality, and this is something that was already in the Thomas Piketty book, when was that? More than a decade ago now.
Yeah.
Capital in the 21st Century, where he had this chart, wealth inequality in Britain. But if you look at it, almost all of that increase that he showed was really an increase in property wealth. So, and that then leads us back to our old hobby horse, which I sometimes hate that we keep hanging on about this, like being complete monomaniacs about this, but it's just true. It's in the Piketty chart, and he was trying to make the point that this is somehow inherent in capitalism, but how can that be the case if it's really just one asset where this is happening? And then this is really then just the effect that you see whether there are all these charts, home ownership rates, where you can compare the generations at similar points of their life cycle. So you look at millennials when they were 30. How does this compare to Generation X when they were at the same age? And it is just a clear trend that home ownership rates among people born after 1980 or so are massively lower than for previous cohorts, previous generations. But that is because of the things that we usually obsess about here. Yeah. There's nothing inherent in capitalism here, and that's also if you're a Gary Stevenson type and you worry about wealth inequality, that is what you should focus on. It's really just fix the housing market. That's a much more direct way of. It would accidentally result in a more egalitarian wealth distribution, even though that wouldn't be the intention of it and shouldn't be the main reason for doing it. It's just good economics generally to allow more economic activity to happen, including house building, but by no means limited to that. It would, among many other good things, result in a more egalitarian wealth distribution. And that's a much more elegant way of going about it. If that is your priority, then a wealth tax, for the reasons that we mentioned last time, that been tried lots of times, doesn't really work well, raises little revenue, causes a lot of bureaucracy. So there's a reason why everyone's abandoning it.
Yeah. Very well put, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, obviously this always depends on which precise set of figures you look at, but I think it's maybe even more than 10 to 20 years that wealth inequality has been basically flat. I think on the Gini coefficient, on sort of the top 1% share of wealth, on the top 10% share of wealth, it looks pretty much flat going back to 1980, and maybe with a slight increase, but nothing major. So certainly nothing new and nothing significant enough to explain why the economy seems to have stagnated so severely over the last 15 years, say. Now, people on the left, I think, and there's a lot of this argument out there at the moment, they'll say, well, yeah, don't worry about all of those figures. That's not what matters. The point is there's a lot more wealth now. So for a given level of inequality, it's just much more significant because there's more wealth out there. Wealth is more significant compared to income than it used to be. And I'm not really sure that holds a lot of water either, frankly. I mean, that may be statistically true, but to the extent that it is, I think that's largely it's a housing effect, as Kristian said, and as it showed in Piketty's work. So focus on the things that really make a difference here. So I think that there's two other arguments that come up with this, and I already alluded to one. One is this the cause of our low growth? Well, it doesn't seem to me to be recent enough or significant enough to have an explaining power here. But I also think it points to kind of a divide in economic thinking and the way different camps view this question of growth. Because for those who sort of favour the wealth tax, who think wealth inequality is a huge problem, often the argument is, well, the reason we have low growth is because poorer people who have a higher propensity to spend don't have enough money. So there's a lack of aggregate demand effectively, and growth is suffering as a result. And this is basically sort of Keynesian style economic thinking. We would look at it from a different perspective and say, actually the reason we have low growth is because of all the constraints on the supply side of the economy. They could be taxed. A lot of them are regulatory, housing, energy, everything else. And equally, we would say, it's not all about spending. Actually, capital accumulation is the really important factor in driving economic growth, because it's that investment which sort of is the seed corn of future prosperity. So don't think, as many of these left-wing critics seem to suggest, that rich people are just sitting on mountains of gold coins and marveling at the glittering wealth that they have. Actually, their money is very frequently invested and productive and helping drive forward kind of progress at a societal level. So needless to say, I don't buy that argument that wealth inequality is at the root of our slow growth problem. Now, the other thing people say is that we just don't tax wealth enough in Britain. I had a quick look at this, and that doesn't seem to me to be true either. So the OECD very helpfully collects revenue statistics for all 38 of its member countries. And so you can select all the different taxes which you think might be taxes that apply to wealth. So capital gains tax, inheritance tax, property taxes, taxes on financial and capital transactions like stamp duty, for example. And you can sort of sort the countries by how much as a percentage of GDP they raise from all of these sources. And the funny thing is, when you look through it, you actually see that Britain comes pretty near the top. So it's taxing these things more heavily than most of its competitor countries. So I think the latest year they've got data for is 2022. And there are 36 countries listed for 2022. And looking at that, we raise more as a percentage of GDP from recurrent property taxes than anyone else. We raise the 5th highest amount of capital gains tax, the 7th highest amount of inheritance tax, and the 6th highest amount from these capital transaction taxes. Now, this does not seem to me to be a country which is clearly taxing wealth at too low a level. I think you can have an interesting argument about whether we're doing it the right way, about the structure of those taxes, about whether they're fair. All of that is fair game. And some people will say, okay, you're raising a lot of money, but you should do it in a more progressive way. So the wealthiest are paying more and the moderately wealthy are paying less. Okay, we can have that argument, but I think you're then talking about distributions rather than the kind of total amount of tax you're imposing on wealth. So just on so many levels, this argument, which has reared its head again, seems to me not to add up. And I suppose it's interesting to think, why is this all coming up now? Well, partly the reason I think the newspapers and so on have picked up on it is because there's a good story from the spring statement with the government, a Labour government, cutting benefits. And people are saying, well, they've done this and that hurts poor people. They could have just taxed rich people more. So I can see where there's a nice framing there. But I also think that these kind of conversations are kind of inevitable in a low growth or zero growth society, because everything becomes zero sum. Everything becomes dog eat dog. And if the pie isn't growing, people will say, well, I just want more of this pie. And that guy's got loads. Give me some of that. And it's unfortunate because the government, I think rightly, will resist all of this stuff. But if they're in a situation where they don't feel they can cut public spending anymore, and they've promised not to raise, VAT, income tax, national insurance for whatever that national insurance pledge was worth, I think they're obviously going to look at what are politically easy wins. And so it will be things like pension tax relief, capital gains tax, tax on unpopular businesses like tobacco companies or whatever, oil companies. And I think we can very easily get into a situation where the tax system gets worse and worse. It doesn't really yield a lot more revenue, probably does continue to undermine growth, but that is sort of the dynamic. You can get into a vicious circle when there's not enough growth. So basically, how often do we say you just have to break out of that dynamic? And you need supply-side liberalization and capital deepening to make that happen.
Yeah, small addition on the Keynesian point, this claim that the economy isn't growing because the wealth is hoarded by the rich and they have a lower propensity to consume. And this doesn't work even in Keynesian terms. Even if you think that consumption is the sole source of growth and savings are just a leakage, something that disappears from the economy. Well, okay, even if you use the pure Keynesian model, savings are just deferred consumption. It's not that... even if you think savings are completely unproductive, okay, but even then, at some point, the consumption happens. Somebody who saves will be saving for something, either for a specific product that they want to buy or for a specific later stage in their life. At some point, it has to happen. So you don't buy the car now, you save for 5 years, but then it happens in 5 years. And if that is the source of growth, then the growth should happen in 5 years from now. And so you cannot, even if you try to explain this purely in Keynesian terms, you cannot explain a long-term, a secular growth problem in that way. The whole point of Keynesianism is that it's a model to explain a short-term economic slump. You can explain why the economy in this particular year, that particular year, doesn't grow when it should, is below its potential, below the fundamentals. But what we're talking about here is an 18-year or so period with almost no growth. And you can't explain that by somebody just saving too much. I mean, if somebody has been saving for 18 years, still not buying anything, well, I'm guessing that there must be a spending spree just around the corner then.
Indeed. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. But thank you both, and thank you for watching too. As mentioned, follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk for all of our content straight to your inbox. And catch us again next week on the IEA podcast. Until then, thank you very much.